Welcome to this episode of Project UnderStory, a podcast where we talk with the everyday conservationist reimagining what it means to live within nature.
Hi, thank you for joining us at Project UnderStory. This is our first episode, and in it we'll be speaking with Professor Bram Büscher, Chair of the Sociology of Development and Change Group at Wageningen University. The reason we wanted to speak with Professor Büscher in particular for our first episode is because the book he co-authored with Robert Fletcher, titled The Conservation Revolution, easily condenses a lot of the major trends in conservation over the years. On a personal note, one of the reasons I wanted to speak with Bram in particular was I wanted to see how the hopeful message of convivial conservation could be communicated in a way that my friends and family could understand. This is our first episode. Our equipment's a little rudimentary. We hope you enjoy it nevertheless. Thank you. Hello. Today we'll be interviewing Bram Büscher. Bram Büscher is Professor and Chair of the Sociology of Development and Change Group at Wageningen University here in the Netherlands, and visiting Professor at the Department of Geography, Environmental Management and Energy Studies of the University of Johannesburg. His research revolves around the political economy of the environment and development, with specific interests in biodiversity, conservation, new media, and digitalization, violence, and extraction. His broader theoretical approach seeks to bring biodiversity, human, non-human relations, and conservation deeper into our understanding of the historical and contemporary trajectories of global capitalism. Bram has published over 90 peer-reviewed articles, and counting I assume, and chapters, and is the author of Transforming the Frontier, Peace, Parks and the Politics of Neoliberal Conservation in Southern Africa. Together with Robert Fletcher, he authored The Conservation Revolution, Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene, the core topics of which we will be discussing today. Bram, thank you for joining UnderStory. Before we begin, could you please share with our listeners a little about the book and how that relates to what you do here in Wageningen?
So Wageningen is a life sciences university, so it mainly focuses on the very broad sort of domain of the living environment, agriculture, biodiversity, climate, etc., and how it impacts people's lives in a very broad way, both from the life sciences and the social sciences, different perspectives. And so the book, in its most succinct way, I guess, is a reflection on how conservation has been changing. The conservation field has been changing over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, under the basic enormous pressure of the growing sixth extinction crisis. So, as you know, we're in a sixth extinction crisis where the culprit are humans in a very broad sort of way. I think actually capitalism, but people are the one species. Human beings are at the forefront of putting pressure on all of the rest of life, leading to an extinction crisis in terms of biodiversity, and how conservation biologists are increasingly really worried about this and trying to find new ways forward for conservation. And the book basically looks at those conservation paradigms, how they have been changing, analyzes them, critically assesses them, and then proposes an alternative sort of going forward. I think that's
Thank you.
In the shortest way possible.
Short and sweet, thanks. I think it's what I'd like to start off with is actually the role of the social sciences. In the book, you say the Anthropocene challenge is not just about how to act on what science teaches us concerning the state of the global environment. Another equally fundamental challenge is that it has given massive impetus to long-standing discussions on how to reinterpret the role of science in the first place. And I think the reason that stood out to me when I was reading the book was conservation has also long been seen as the domain of the natural sciences. In some countries, like Sri Lanka, where I'm from, it's seen as the reserve of ecologists, botanists, geologists, among other natural scientists. And the social science contribution to conservation sometimes tends to be seen as less practical. But I'm very curious as to, for listeners who might be curious about the social science applications as we sort of interrogate these conservation topics, What do you think the social sciences and humanities contribute to how we face emerging challenges in the Anthropocene with ecosystems, and especially with how it comes to how we understand the role of science itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely a foundational question. For me, the social sciences are paramount, right? Are equally, if not perhaps even more important than the natural sciences. But the core of my argument would actually be is that you can't separate the natural and the social, right? So one of our key foundational points in the book, right? So we have this very simplistic analysis basically of the conservation field along two axes, right? In reality, of course, it's much more complex, but the two core issues relate to the human nature dichotomy, humans and the rest of nature, and how conservation is situated vis-a-vis the global political economy of capitalism. Now, we want to move beyond that dichotomy between humans and the rest of nature, which also implies moving beyond the dichotomy between the natural and the social sciences.
Yes.
In many ways. That distinction itself is actually pretty fake in many ways. It has grown into what we see now, hyper-specialized scientific disciplines over the last 150 years. But if you go 150 years back, these disciplines weren't even there, right? The social and the natural, for almost all of eternity in terms of history, were always, they always came together. They were never separated in the ways that we have now. But many people don't really see that anymore because academia forces people to hyper-specialize. And of course, the power of knowledge and how knowledge shapes things really matters also in terms of the positions that certain people can take in fields like conservation. Right? So natural scientists have also historically owned, right, or taken this power. Like, we know a lot about the environment, hence we get to speak for the environment and be central in conservation. But many conservationists that I know, natural scientists, the fantastic, colleagues, often after many years themselves say, wait a minute, I've studied animals and all that, but conservation is actually more about people. It's actually much more about people.
Yeah.
And hence we need the social sciences. But then you've only taken one step, right? So that's an important step. We need the social sciences, yes. But the social sciences are not all the same. The social sciences doesn't mean, now all of a sudden you understand the human and what the human is, right? Social science theory, of course, is very different from many natural sciences. It's different ways of approaching social reality with its massive contradictions. And these contradictions don't go away just because you study social sciences. But you can understand them better and deal with them perhaps a little bit better and in a more integrated way. That for us is the real contribution of social science. That's the next step. The first is the acknowledgement of. The next is a deeper understanding of social sciences where there's not just one answer, this is how you deal with people. No, you understand the complexity of the social dynamics, of different people, of historical relations, and find ways to situate yourself in relation to that both does justice to the contradictions and the nuances, whilst perhaps also rising above them to make bigger horizons and new directions possible. Again, that was one of the core things that we tried to do in the book, right? To at some point not just say, okay, we stay with, okay, this all complex, and no, but how can you then take a step back from the complexity and the contradictions to chart a broader way forward? That in the end we'll need to deal with those complexities and contradictions. And I'm in the middle of all of that now. But it also creates, and that is what some life scientists feel sometimes uncomfortable with, a political direction, right, for your science and for your action, for your policy engagement in a particular direction that's different from the directions we've taken so far, and that have led us into the sixth extinction crisis. And that's I think what social sciences can really contribute, making those kind of things clearer and helping to push the new political direction forward.
Have you seen maybe in recent times areas in which social science has contributed to re-engaging with these topics, maybe because you've got a specialization in, you've done lots of research in Southern Africa, for example, and approaching conservation topics there. I could imagine the social science approach really helps you interrogate some of these things a little more critically.
Yeah.
How have you seen this manifest where the social sciences has really made us look at how we manage the environment?
Yeah. So again, the last point that was made is to phrase it a little bit differently. There's not one social science approach.
Yes.
There are multiple social science approaches, right? Different kind of theories of how you look at the world. Knowing these theories helps you position yourself in relation to them, and also you can try to play around with different kind of theoretical ideas in order to get new directions going. And I think that's exactly what I've seen how social science can contribute. So, give you a very practical example about Southern Africa, and you know that because you've also done work in Southern Africa.
Yes.
I know that. So you've seen that yourself. But one of the big issues in Southern Africa has been the rhino poaching crisis. I think you were in Namibia, right?
I was in Namibia.
Yeah. So you may have seen it there to some degree as well. Right?
Heard about it, but didn't see it face to face. The rhino poaching crisis.
Yeah, you don't have to see it face to face. No. But I mean, even in Namibia, but also other countries, there is this poaching crisis. Also elephants, of course, and other species, for sure. But what often happened, so 10 years ago, maybe a little bit further back, even maybe 12, 13 years, the sort of approach to that was military expansion, sort of conservation violence, what we call green violence, myself and my colleague Manu Ramasandela. And a lot of social scientists critically looked at that and tried to understand, okay, so where does that sort of impulse towards violence come from, first and foremost? And secondly, how can we move beyond that impulse of violence to look at deeper structural issues that are not addressed through violence, and in fact made worse through this violence, to do justice to these historical injustices and move forward in new directions, right? So with colleagues in Southern Africa, we've looked at what we call living landscapes that really try to do justice to people living in conservation areas. So in this project, for example, we had junior researchers stationed in the communities for almost 2 years to really understand in much more depth and you start to build up trust, learn new things about how historical things keep coming back and how people feel they're not taken seriously. And on that basis of trust, you can actually, with new theoretical ideas, chart different kind of ways forward. And in South Africa, at the moment, this is quite exciting because a lot of actors, including South African national parks and others, are really playing with these kind of ideas. And yeah, maybe immodestly coming from a social scientist, but I think a lot of that drive came from the social sciences.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm always curious because I've felt that sometimes the contribution of the social sciences, many contributions and angles with which we approach things, tends to get neglected. So I really wanted to see your answer to how we can inform other people about that contribution. But moving more back to the book a little bit, you mentioned the crucial difference between mainstream conservation, everything that we've done in the past, and the two radical alternatives. And convivial conservation is that we explicitly start from a political ecology perspective steeped in a critique of capitalist political economy. For our listeners who maybe come from outside the academic realm, what exactly is convivial conservation and what does it mean when we use terms like political ecology and a critique of the capitalist political economy?
Yeah, I mean, again, you ask the big questions, right? So I think that's really good. Why do we need to talk about capitalism? I mean, let me start with that, right? I mean, in fact, I think even many of your listeners or others, most people would acknowledge that we live under a capitalist economy, but the term is often never used. And so, why is that? Right? Because if you dig deeper into this, you actually start seeing certain patterns of how capitalism actually unfolds in reality. Not all of that is completely bad, right? The point is not whether everything is completely bad or good, but you can understand structural features of how society works. We've been living under capitalism, for over 500 years, at least in the West. Many other parts of the world have been gradually incorporated in long processes, right? Often very violent processes of incorporation into industrial capitalism through colonialism and slavery, settler colonialism, etc. So that, for me, is just a basic fact, right? We live under capitalism, so you need to understand that. Under capitalism, we have come to a situation where we have problems that weren't there before. A global climate crisis, right? A sixth extinction crisis caused by people within the capitalist system. Ginormous inequality on a massive scale, right? We also have a lot of good things in our lives, thankfully, right? You and I think, both are appreciative of good healthcare and other things, right? They may have come under other political economic systems as well, but they have emerged under capitalism. And a lot of other stuff that we like in our daily lives, amenities and all kinds of things that make our lives easier or more fun, are also part of this world, right? So you need to sort of take these things, I think, into account, and then come with a theoretical idea about how that works. And political ecology, the other part of your question, is about integrating politics, so political science, with ecological questions, right? So understanding different theoretical sort of entry points into the reality of the world, in particular, as we said, capitalism, because that is the system that we live under. And so that's what we do in the book. We try to discuss different sort of theories in political ecology. Political ecology is more of an outlook, a critical sort of look at the relation between politics and ecology under capitalism. And of course, there are different theories, sort of like more, from Foucault, or more than human, right, that focus on how non-humans relate to all these processes. So we focus a bit more in the book on the relation between post-Marxian approaches, post-Foucauldian approaches that take capitalist power very seriously. That's the sort of post-Marxian approach. And on the other hand, sort of the more post-Foucauldian approach, which really looks at how are these things governed, right? How does it end up in terms of how governments function and how these things are legitimated in our language. And when we sort of like look at the pros and cons, we come to a specific sort of suggestion forward for conservation that we started calling convivial conservation, which basically is situated on two, or is founded on two prime principles. We're still doing a lot of work now, sort of figuring out more details, but the two big principles are moving beyond the nature-culture dichotomy, or the human-nature dichotomy. Sort of, instead of separating people and the rest of nature, we need to integrate them, and moving beyond capitalism as the ultimate way to move beyond the problems that capitalism has created, right? That I mentioned before. So this also makes it critical, because critical basically means you don't look for solutions within the existing framework of power, capitalism, but you actually see how that system actually becomes the problem itself, and want to look beyond that. Now that's a big thing, because that's a big challenge, because capitalism is a big thing in the world. It's in constant turmoil and upheaval, as we see now with Trump and Modi and goodness knows what in the world. But still, we think you can then take smaller steps, and that's what we also propose in the book in relation to convivial conservation, to try to get to the ultimate bigger goal, maybe later on, in maybe decades from now, but still. So I think that's sort of the approach. But I still haven't explained what convivial conservation is, but I'll let you interject first.
If you could distill maybe convivial conservation for someone who was outside, who hadn't read the book.
Yeah.
How would you describe it in maybe a sentence or two?
again, for us, convivial conservation tries to integrate humans and nature into new forms of economic development that are not focused on growth, but on finding a way to balance human needs with those of the rest of life. That would be the shortest way.
And how would you say that how that makes it distinct or different from both traditional conservation? I think we've touched on that a little bit, but also the other radical conservation models. In the book, you and Fletcher discuss, for example, the rambunctious garden.
Yeah.
How is it distinct in that it approaches these things differently from the others?
Yeah, and this is where the slightly simplistic model comes in, but I think it's very revealing. So what we're saying is that mainstream conservation was mainly focused on separating people and nature through protected areas. Right, protected areas are still one of the main tools in the conservation toolbox. But the problem is, you create this sort of people-free nature, and that doesn't allow people to actually have that relation with nature. And even deeper, it kind of means that we don't trust ourselves to live with nature, right? So we just see ourselves as destroyers, and so we must put nature separate from ourselves. And a lot of mainstream conservation also has a very problematic relationship with humans more generally, right? I think humans are the problem, all humans, and that human populations are too big. Well, we've grown a lot, but if we all live like people would generally do in some countries in the world will be a lot more sustainable than what it is currently. So these are, I think, problems with mainstream conservation on the side of the nature, of the culture, human nature sort of distinction or dichotomy. The other side is in relation to our dominant system of capitalism. They've never really been critical of that system, always worked within the system, and have actually been quite successful in a certain way. And we also show in the book, in terms of the history, how over time there was a logic to this, right? Like if through industrial development a lot of ecosystems are destroyed, through building harbors, airports, bigger roads, whatever, a lot of animals, die and species die out, then obviously you want to stop that and put like a line in the sand and say up to here and no further. Mm-hmm. So there's a historical logic to that. But that logic started living a life of its own. It became protected areas. They work to some degree. Usually within protected area boundaries, animals do better, although nowadays with climate change that is also becoming increasingly an issue, especially with amphibians, fishes, birds and other species. As that sort of tendency to work within capitalism moved further, and capitalism started becoming bigger and bigger and growing way out of proportion to the proportions that we have now. What we saw is that the protected area growth in the world didn't actually stop the extinction crisis. In fact, the extinction crisis became worse next to the growth of protected areas. Mm-hmm. And so, basically, we and many others concluded from that ultimately, in a growing system that puts more and more pressure on nature and humans, protected areas will not, in the end, stop that process. Right? They halted in some places, but the overarching sort of motor of the economy keeps putting more and more pressure. And so that was increasingly recognized within the community, and two alternatives sort of popped up. And that's basically, again, as I said at the start of the book, new conservationists like Emma Morris, who wrote the book The Rambunctious Garden, were saying protected areas haven't worked, we need to move beyond them, and so we need to do things completely different, and they called that new conservation, and said, okay, let's do justice to people much more, let's integrate humans and nature much more, but in the current economy. So they didn't critique capitalism. In fact, many of them explicitly said, no, we must, pursue things like natural capital, payments for ecosystem services, all kinds of ways in which to turn nature further into capitalist markets. The opposite side, sort of in response to that, a group that we call neo-protectionists said, that's ridiculous. That's just surrendering conservation to development, to consumerism, to growth. They're actually quite critical of growth. They want to move beyond consumerism, beyond growth, beyond capitalism. But they said, but the way to do that, amongst others, is by increasing the space for nature in protected areas, even up to 50% of the planet. So half Earth, this idea that E.O. Wilson came up with. And so you've got these two different sort of neo-protectionists, neo-conservationists, and we looked at them and said, okay, both are actually taking an important step. The one moving beyond the nature-culture dichotomy, the other one beyond capitalism, but they're doing one instead of both. What if we do both? Go and beyond the nature-culture dichotomy and beyond capitalism. And that's what we call convivial conservation. So that's how we got to it and how we sort of build our critique in the book.
I'm just wondering, how much do you think maybe things like the Rambunctius can be co-opted to sort of further other aspects in which we live? What struck me when I read the book, and it was my first sort of foray into reading about the Rambunctius garden. I know it's from Maris, but I've heard people argue, for example, you see a lot of the melting ice caps and people wanting to go and mine there, and the argument is we can mine and then create green technologies. Yeah. And that seems like people are trying to sort of exploit the system the changing system in which we live under the guise of let's make everything green. We can take all these rare minerals and can it be co-opted like that?
Yeah, very much so.
Yes.
And in fact, I think new conservation in that sense already self-consciously said, we must go in and through capitalism. And Maris maybe not so much explicitly, but some others were more explicit in that sort of regard. Said, we must work according to natural capital. But the problem with capitalism, is it is a system that must continuously grow. Mm-hmm. That is the hallmark of capitalism. Capital means putting forth something of value in order to make more of it. So it's baked into the very definition of capital itself. Right? Many people see capital as some kind of resource, human capital, natural capital. But no, it's a process. It's a dynamic, right? It's a motion of continuous growth. And that motion of growth must always, in one way or another, keep, opening new markets in order to continue this growth. So if the market for oil or fossil fuels would go down, which it isn't, right, at all. In fact, it's expanding, and that's super problematic. But in case it goes down, you must expand it and must create a new market that sort of allows for the same kind of growth, right, through renewables. But renewables don't come out of nothing either, right? The batteries, the things that I also have on the roof here, like solar panels and all that, must also come from somewhere. So all kinds of new mining is being done for all these things that in and of themselves also have a huge footprint. And the logic behind that is what a 19th century political economist already sort of said. He said, if in a growing system you make things more efficient, but you put more and more of them into the world, the end result is not less impact, but more impact. Right? And that's, I think, one of the key issues with capitalism itself. So these things won't work.
Maybe this is a good point at which to segue, because we're talking so much about growth. And you discussed in the book as well the idea of degrowth. Mm-hmm. Could you maybe, for listeners, explain how we can realistically sort of contend with degrowth as we sort of in our day-to-day, or how we look at economies and so forth?
Yeah, so degrowth is a particular movement. Many people from different parts of Europe, including Barcelona, in France, but also increasingly around the world, whereby people say, okay, we need to come to the core of what capitalism is about, namely growth, and basically stop doing that, right? At least not make that the official policy goal of our economy. Right? Certain things we want to grow. I mean, I want, my daughter to grow. It's nice to grow intellectually. There are many things that are okay. And then, at some point these things stop growing and and like sometimes they wilt and go back into nature. That's kind of normal for organic processes, right? But if the economy just has to grow no matter what, it creates the problems that we see in the world today. So that's the sort of the degrowth movement, and we sort of said, okay, we agree with that, but they don't really have an explicit conservation arm or domain yet. And so we feel that our proposition of convivial conservation really can be, right, the sort of like conservation branch, if you will, of a broader degrowth movement, so that these different movements also strengthen each other. Convivial conservation on its own is not the solution, right? We need to do it together with other domains in regenerative agriculture, and degrowth in relation to the broader economy, feminist movements in relation to, gender equality, all kinds of other, decolonial movements, etc.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that was going to be my next question, the importance of decolonial and other movements in that, but you've touched on them. So I'll just move to the next one. Even outside conservation circles, more people are becoming disillusioned with capitalism and are looking for ways to sort of check out of the system. Convivial conservation, it offers a vision for transforming systems so that humans and nature can thrive together. But in day-to-day reality, the system is quite persistent. Mm-hmm. In places like Sri Lanka, where I've worked, the idea of protected areas, community-based models, and the neoliberal instruments are deeply entrenched. Yeah. And my question is, how can convivial conservation meaningfully challenge these market-driven models, especially in post-colonial contexts where institutions and mindsets reflect these older paradigms?
Well, maybe let me disagree with you one thing over there, because I'm not so sure whether that's more so in post-colonial contexts. Mm-hmm. In fact, I've seen a lot of, and we are inspired very much by all kinds of post-colonial movements, particularly from India, Sri Lanka, but also in Africa, Southern Africa, Latin America, other parts of Asia, where I believe people are actually a lot further in thinking through these kind of issues on a very practical and also theoretical level, mm-hmm. right? And how to connect the practical and the theoretical. I think in Europe and North America, there are a lot of people worried about this, but I think here they're even more deeply ingrained into mainstream ways of doing things. That makes it hard to really get out of that. At the same time, both in the global south and in the global north, you see more and more people wanting to break out of that. But then, you're basically banging your head against 150-year-old wall exactly. that's been standing and being built, that's been built for a long time. And that's just simply not that easy. One thing that we are trying to do now with convivial conservation is to sort of take it to a next level. Sort of build a network around convivial conservation, people that are interested in this, in alternative ways for conservation going forward. And we've identified with a global group of people, including from the countries that I just mentioned, in the global south and in the global north, several areas where we think, okay, here we can start to make key differences into how conservation works and can work in the future. The key in that is to always bridge and connect grounded practices with global or more theoretical policy engagements, right? To always connect the local and the global, the short term and the long term, the practical and the theoretical. These things also can't be separated, right? So the key elements or the key areas where we think we should do that kind of work first is protected area outreach. From protected areas, try to reintegrate that into the broader surroundings to actually go much deeper than sort of community-based or participatory management, but really create commons between parks and local communities and farmers, right? That goes much deeper, that creates relations of trust, mm-hmm. whereby these fences become less and less important.
Yes.
Right? And use that as an inspiration to see, you can do this differently. And in the process, these animals will have perhaps more space to wander around, right? Whereby you really need to take care, because in many places there are dangerous animals as well, right? So it's not always easy, but as you know, I mean, there are many tiger reserves in India where people live right next to tigers. Of course, sometimes things happen, like things happen with cars here, and we never say we should stop driving. You need to learn to live with them. Convivial, right? And that is a process that we're trying to sort of like stimulate. A second sort of suite of projects that we're trying to develop is based on what other colleagues call community-based ecological restoration. How people in local levels in different parts of the world are themselves taking efforts to restore their local environment, to create new human-nature relations. What are they doing? Why are they successful or not? Right? What are the main challenges, and how can we support them and connect them to a broader initiative that also wants to make sure that these are key movements and moments and initiatives going forward, right? So that these can spread. A third is working in relation to regenerative agriculture. Agriculture is one of the biggest pressures on biodiversity, as we all know. So somehow we need to change the agricultural system. But many forward-looking farmers, there are many, right? In the Dutch context, there are the toekomstboeren, the future farmers, and many other parts of the world. Of course, we know La Via Campesina, regenerative farmers, but they're usually small little islands in the sea of mainstream farming with lots of chemical inputs, and it's like I call it green death, right? Like sometimes these fields look nice, they look green, but they're just one species and there's no biodiversity at all, right? And it's just maximizing production. So how can we also take these kind of regenerative farmers seriously as conservationists and help them become conservationists in their own right and be recognized as convivial conservationists? So that's a third sort of, and then we have a couple other things, but those are some of the things that we are currently working on.
The reason I brought up maybe that post-colonial, decolonial, is because I've sometimes spoken with people in Sri Lanka who come from areas where there's lots of elephants.
Right.
And traditionally they would have lived very close to the elephants. But once I met someone who said, I have a solution. Let's take all the elephants, round them up and put them in a park. And that's what I meant maybe in sort of the aftermath of colonialism. There's been a lot of epistemicide. And people now believe that maybe the protected area narratives are very strong. And maybe that's what because I also did my research on human-leopard interactions in tea estates. And those are areas of industry and nature where they overlap. And sometimes when I would interview people in the communities, they would say, oh, like, this is the human side, that is the nature side. And those dichotomies still are quite, they exist still. And yes, people are trying to shake them off, but I'm also very interested in how we can, because they've been entrenched for so long, how do we eradicate them from people's thinking?
I mean, eradicate is a big word. For me, I mean, this is a process, right? These dichotomies didn't come into being overnight, right? That in itself sometimes took decades, if not sometimes centuries, right? That people accepted that you don't live with nature in that way anymore, right? The extinction of subsistence living of the peasantry is a huge part of the history of how capitalism actually emerged globally and in Europe. And so living with animals and species is also something that will take time, right? And that is, again, very difficult when you deal with large, dangerous animals like elephants, like rhinos, like lions, tigers, any of the other sort of big animals that we know. And even smaller ones sometimes can be super annoying, right? Rats and you name it, snakes, and sometimes people don't want to live with them either. So it all sounds easy that you want to separate things. And again, historically, even with indigenous communities, there have been certain separations, right? Villages, were also spaces where certain animals didn't come and were avoided. But they were just not as sharp, and they were often, negotiated in different ways. And that art of negotiation, I think, is something that we need to relearn. And that is a process going forward. How can you renegotiate between different actors a certain form of trust, whereby you can live with other species in a more expansive way, right? In ways that we have unlearned, but at the same time, also see that as a trial and error process going forward, whereby mistakes will be made, and sometimes, like, if there's a problematic species that themselves cause a lot of havoc, I will be the last one to say, yeah, they should not kill it, right? Sometimes a tiger or elephant becomes so problematic, yeah, perhaps it needs to be killed. I personally don't have a big problem with that. Unfortunately, that is part of conservation in and of itself. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I do believe in is, if slowly but surely, right, the economy around areas and within areas changes, to stop putting so much pressure on the land, to take even more out of it all the whole time, more tourists, more food, more leisure, more buildings, more whatever, right? Then it literally and figuratively opens up space in people's lives. We should be a bit less busy, right? To think through how can we live differently with other species, but also literally geographical space for species to wander around on larger areas.
Yes.
So you have less concentration, which makes it easier to live with many species. And this is not from me. This is the wisdom we got from an old wise man in the north of South Africa, who told us. This was such a, for me, profound kind of thing, theoretically and empirically, like saying, like, yeah, but I mean, so we used to live with these animals all the time. It's something I had heard before, of course, but these animals were spread out over a much longer distance. When you congregate them in a protected area and they are free to procreate, right? You get so many of them that you can't live with them anymore. Then there are too many elephants or too many certain species. So the balance of the amount of species and the amount of people in relation to each other's needs, right, also needs to be recalibrated. Mm-hmm. And he said, we can live with them. If, elephants come by us once a day, it's not a problem. But 20 times a day, that's a problem. Right? And this needs to be recalibrated over, I think, a longer period of time.
Thank you. In the book, you and Robert Fletcher call for 6 key transitions. Mm-hmm. Could you maybe walk the listeners through what exactly these 6 shifts are and what they mean, and reflect radically a different approach to how we protect, live and relate to nature, live with and relate to nature?
So which 6 are you talking about specifically?
So we have moving from protected to promoted areas, celebrating human and non-human nature.
Because I thought it was 5, right?
I remember 6 when I read the book. Maybe I need to just.
Yeah, maybe it's also how we structured it.
Yes.
I think you may actually be right, but we structured it in different ways. But yeah. So sorry.
Oh no! So it was from protected to promoted areas, from celebrating human and moving to celebrating human and non-human natures, from touristic voyeurism to engaged visitation, moving from spectacular environmentalism to everyday environmentalism, moving from privatized expert technocracy to common democratic engagement, and from natural capital to embedded value.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The last one we had sort of like, because that's such a foundational thing, right? So we had those 5, and then the value question is a foundational element that sort of undergirds all of these. So yeah, these for us were all long-term propositions, mm-hmm. right? So what we try to think through when we came up with Convivial Conservation, okay, how can we make this practical? And with practical, I mean both on the ground, but also in terms of policy and more policy directions, sort of practical theory. How can you think differently about these things? Mm-hmm. These are all sort of more longer term sort of ideals for what convivial conservation could look like in the future. Moving beyond that human nature dichotomy, right? So no longer separating people and the rest of nature, and moving beyond growth. So the first one, from protected to promoted areas basically says, okay, protected areas have saved a lot of nature, for sure, species, but ultimately they don't stop the extinction crisis, so we need to do something else. And that means we need to trust ourselves again and not protect nature from ourselves. We are also nature, so we can't protect nature if we are also nature from ourselves. It becomes a little messy. Right? Sorry to the to the viewers. It becomes very messy, like, yeah, somehow, we blame ourselves for what we ourselves also are, nature. No, we must find a way to live with the rest of nature in a way that creates some kind of, perhaps uneasy, but still some kind of balance, and not something that puts more and more pressure. The promoted areas is also a language shift. It's like, instead of protection, right, keeping something away from something else, it's also about sharing it, being proud of it, right? We want to promote the love that many people have for the rest of nature, and really celebrate that in all kinds of ways. And hence, in another kind of economy, that would be possible on a larger scale. And hence you can reintegrate protected areas into the surrounding areas and actually create new human-nature relations towards the future. And that's something like a more positive vision than just protecting it from ourselves, by promoting it to ourselves, and that we can do this differently. The second is a little bit more philosophical in a certain way, changing human nature. But let me make that very practical. Under capitalism, many people are viewed as like people like rational beings who all want to maximize our profits, right? And go for growth, etc. All that. So that's the typical human nature under capitalism. Like people who are sort of self-aware can market themselves, or look super cool and always in control on Twitter, but actually are all nervous wrecks because we're all stressed out, of course. So we're saying, no, we need a different kind of human nature, right? That is perhaps a little bit more self-aware, more caring, right? Not always in control, can let certain things slide and go, and trust also more in each other and in our relation with the rest of the world in a more open-ended way, rather than privatizing everything and all that. And so the way we practically operationalize or translate that is that we need to, the way that we as humans, what we need, right? We have all these needs in our lives, and capitalism constantly says we need more things, like advertising is constantly, you need this, you need that to be happy, blah, blah, blah. But all those needs are putting a lot of pressure on the needs of our non-human, life partners in this world. They have needs too, and we need to balance those needs out better. That's basically what that second point says. The third point is about tourism. Yeah, I mean, tourism is not the savior of nature, right? Flying people around the world to see biodiversity brings a little bit of income, but again, it's a market-based mechanism that puts ultimately more pressure on the environment than less. So we say, rather than market-based capitalist tourism, been there, done that, quickly made a picture, moving on, next thing, tick wish list, or how do you call that? Like the laundry list of where you need to go. Instead of that, more engaged visitation. Take more time, learn more deeply about an environment, and actually do justice to people and nature on a deeper level, just than having taken the picture and putting it on Instagram. So it's a different idea of tackling the biggest industry in this world, tourism, and also decommoditizing that industry that conservation often depends on. So fourth is, so if I put it very bluntly, from spectacular to ordinary or mundane nature, basically moving away from animal planet natures to the natures around us, right? When we look at TV documentaries, it's often like, oh, look at these lions, they're hunting the whole time, they're doing all this cool stuff, and then you come into a park and they're actually lazy buggers. They're actually sleeping 23 hours. You don't see that on a documentary, of course, but the spectacle brings in attention And again, more money. That's again a hyper-capitalist kind of thing. Oh, like football is so good at that. Right? The FIFA World Cup, everybody needs to look at the match and the game, and what do you think? No, we need to move away from that kind of nature to like, what are the natures around us? The trees right here, the birds. How can we have more connections with those instead of the big spectacular natures? And then the fifth one is to deal differently with that in terms of management and governance. Basically, okay, it's not just experts, people who've studied animals who can do conservation. No, local people sometimes know much better, right? Because they actually negotiate those relations. But sometimes they don't know things better, right? It's not that one knows things better, that different actors can come together, in new ways, but in a new direction. Not in the mainstream direction of conservation, more protected areas, separating. No, a new convivial direction, whereby different types of knowledges can hopefully come together to manage those relationships in new kinds of ways. And people are already doing that. Like I said, community-based ecological restoration happens in many places. People are experimenting. How can you make that the basis of our economy? That kind of experimentation without growth, rather than pushing them ultimately to become growth-oriented. And that's, I think, the five. And underneath all of that is bigger discussions about value. But I think let's leave that for now.
I think that's the kind of words you can leave for another day.
Exactly.
Just to close, as we approach maybe the last question, I think we see that the idea of we have to live with a maybe changing nature that is already fundamentally irreversible, I think, from the impact of humans. It can feel deeply demoralizing to specifically young people today. What are some of the hopeful ways, we've touched on various elements of this, that we can engage with change, and even as we face that sort of sense of urgency and loss? And I'm also very curious as to what gives you hope, as you see how we contend with the effects of the Anthropocene.
Well, let me first acknowledge the fact that and we see this with our students as well, that so many people feel quite hopeless, not very positive about where things are heading in the world. But I'm not so sure whether that should be because we as humans have changed all the rest of nature. I think we've done that through time immemorial in different kind of ways, sometimes with more localized disastrous consequences, right? There have been many extinctions due to people before. And that's always sort of been part of this world. The scale of it and the pressure on it is very different and unique now. And that is because, what I mentioned before, because we live in a capitalist system that created that in particular ways, but also deals with that in very, very particular ways. What gives me hope is, first of all, to try to just understand these things better. Understanding it better, but maybe this is just an academic speaking, helps me to situate myself a little bit better. Like, okay, if I look at history, there have been many big challenges before, and people have also lived through that. Right? Of course, we live in rather crazy times, but there have been exceptional times before, right? In many different people. I mean, the people undergoing slavery must have also thought it was the end of their world. And it was literally the end of their world, right? If whole communities were taken out of certain places, brought somewhere else, and had to labor under excruciatingly violent conditions. But then you also see, like in history, with certain spaces where people find new energy to change their situation and find new paths forward. That gives me hope, right? Like that kind of understanding, inspiration from others. I think there's a book here somewhere that I may have taken it to the office actually, about the Haitian revolution, right? I mean, these were enslaved peoples, and they started the revolution, and they changed, how people in the Western Hemisphere looked at black people, at slavery, etc. And it still took a long time, right? But that was the beginning of the abolition movement in many ways. But not everything went better afterwards. Of course, certain forms of slavery even deepened. But still, the power of people to change their conditions, for me, knowing some of that is in and of itself very hopeful. And I see people trying to do that now as well. Second is to, I think, with a better and deeper understanding of things, more historical, more theoretical, what gives me hope is simply working with other people, like-minded people, who want to fight for a different world in all the different ways. We may not agree all of the times, right? There's never any silver, easy bullet kind of solution, but if you accept that, then you can actually really enjoy the fact that you can work with people for something that is bigger than yourself. Where that leads, for me, is less of a question. I'm not very apocalyptic. Maybe the world is going to hell, as some people say. Yeah, saying that out loud doesn't change my immediate situation. Then still I get a lot of hope and pleasure from working with people like yourselves and others who also want to understand the world differently, change the world in different ways, and are keen on working together and doing exactly that. Tomorrow we have a workshop. It's mostly focused on the critical engagement of conservation, but all people I really appreciate, and I also get hope from them. So it's a dual thing. It's about accepting the painfulness and the tragedy of the world on the one hand, but also finding ways with others to have beautiful moments in and through that, on the other hand, to fight for something you want to fight for. And the rest is out of our hands, right? So at some point I also sometimes feel I'll just accept that. I feel the pressure of the world, like so many people. I'm sure many people who are watching or listening. Yeah, these are not easy times. And especially with the news that's coming at us all the time. But you gotta let go at some point and also just count your blessings, look at the good things, and work for something bigger than yourself. Mm-hmm. And if you see, again, history, many people have done that before. And that gives some hope.
Bram Büscher, thank you for joining UnderStory.
I hope. Very welcome.
It was very good to hear you speak about these topics.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for the wonderful exchange.
Thank you for joining us on our very first episode of Project UnderStory. This is something we've been meaning to do for a while, and it's our first time. Our equipment's a little rudimentary, and we made a few mistakes here and there, to be honest. Regardless, we'd really appreciate your feedback. So if you have anything you'd like to say, please get in touch with us at connect@understorymedia.com. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you on the next episode.